Hello, FreeJord. I really appreciate you watching and commenting. Now, let's listen to the story.
Jax's revenge domain. They handed me the termination papers at 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I read every word twice, signed 3 copies, collected my belongings, and walked out. At 2:13 a.m., my phone erupted with an unknown number. The voice belonged to their senior counsel, and he was shaking. "Mr. Sullivan, please tell me you didn't actually sign those documents." I smiled in the darkness of my bedroom. "I signed exactly what you presented to me, Anthony. You might want to check Section 7, subsection C. Terminations based on performance deficiencies require documented performance improvement plans attached as appendix materials. I see no appendices. Your move." My name is Marcus Sullivan. I'm 47 years old, and I just caught my former employer in the biggest policy violation of their corporate lives. Before we continue, let me establish who I am and how I arrived at this point. 23 years in corporate operations management, the last 16 at Apex Dynamics, progressing from operations manager to VP of strategic operations. I'd overseen 41 major operational initiatives during my tenure, initiatives that generated approximately $750 million in cost savings and efficiency improvements. I'd restructured the supply chain division, reducing overhead by 28%. I'd implemented automated quality control systems that decreased defect rates by 44%. I'd built the strategic operations department from 12 people to 85 people. For all those contributions, I'd been terminated at 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon for consistent performance deficiencies that nobody would actually specify. The termination package sat on my dining room table at 11:23 p.m. that Wednesday night. 3 identical copies, each one signed with my full legal name. Every signature line executed, every initial placed where those yellow tabs indicated. I'd spent 52 minutes reading through all 31 pages of legal documentation that Apex Dynamics had prepared for my departure. The severance terms were mediocre but acceptable. 23 weeks of pay, 1 week for each year I'd given them, health insurance through April, standard non-solicitation and non-disclosure language. What caught my attention wasn't what they'd included, it was what they'd forgotten to attach. Section 7, subsection C, buried on page 11 between clauses about intellectual property and company equipment return. In cases where termination results from documented performance deficiencies, this agreement shall incorporate by reference all performance improvement plans, warning notices, and evaluative materials relevant to said deficiencies attached herein as Appendix B, and forming the factual basis for separation. I'd written that language myself 6 years ago when I'd been promoted to VP and asked to overhaul Apex's human resources policies. Too many talented people had been dismissed on vague accusations. Too many careers destroyed with no paper trail, no accountability, no recourse. So I'd built protections into the system, protections that required documentation, evidence, due process, protections that required companies to actually prove their case before destroying someone's career. I'd seen this game played too many times. New executive comes in, wants to clean house, targets experienced employees they view as expensive or resistant to change, but instead of admitting they wanted fresh faces or lower payroll costs, they'd manufacture performance issues. Create a narrative about poor attitude or failure to adapt. Then they'd fire people and dare them to fight back. Most people don't fight back. They take the severance, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and move on quietly. They're overwhelmed by the termination, worried about money and health insurance and finding new work. They don't have the energy or resources for a legal battle against a corporation with deep pockets. But I wasn't most people, and I'd specifically written policies to prevent exactly what just happened to me. Protections that Apex's HR department had apparently forgotten existed when they decided to fire me for consistent performance deficiencies and failure to meet operational benchmarks. My phone lit up the darkness. Unknown caller. Area code 617 Boston, where Apex maintained their legal operations center. I let it ring 7 times before answering. Marcus Sullivan speaking. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Anthony Cooper from Apex Dynamics Legal Counsel." His voice carried a tremor I'd never heard in our previous interactions. "I apologize for the late hour, but I need to ask you something urgent about the separation documents provided this afternoon." "I'm listening, Anthony. Have you executed the non-disclosure provisions of the termination agreement?" I glanced at the papers on my table, my signature on page 24, directly above the NDA section. I signed everything Apex provided me exactly as your HR director specified. Mr. Sullivan, I need you to understand something critical. There may have been a documentation error in the materials we supplied. We're prepared to offer you a chance to review revised paperwork. What sort of error? My voice remained perfectly neutral. Years of corporate negotiations had taught me never to show my cards too early. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics telephonically, but if you haven't yet executed the agreement, we'd appreciate scheduling a meeting to address certain corrections. I executed all documents at approximately 7:30 p.m. this evening. I scanned the completed package and transmitted it to your HR department at 7:51 p.m. Is something wrong with your documentation? The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Background voices filtered through. Someone was conducting an emergency meeting at Apex's legal offices at 2 in the morning. That told me everything I needed to know about how serious this was. Mr. Sullivan, Anthony's voice returned, tighter now. Can you clarify what you mean by executed all documents? I mean, I signed the separation agreement as presented, every page initialed where indicated, every signature line completed, the full 31-page document that HR Director Michelle Barnes provided during my termination meeting at 4:15 p.m. today. And the appendices. Did you review the attached appendices? What appendices? The document I received contained no appendices, just the 31-page separation agreement. Another extended silence. I heard someone curse distinctly in the background. Multiple voices now. This wasn't just Anthony working late. This was a full crisis management team assembled at 2 a.m. Then Anthony's voice, barely maintaining professional composure. Mr. Sullivan, the separation agreement should have included appendix materials. Specifically, if termination was classified as performance-based, there should have been performance improvement documentation attached as Appendix B. Should have been, Anthony? Interesting phrasing. Because according to Section 7, subsection C of the separation agreement I signed, performance-based terminations must be accompanied by PIP documentation. Not should be, must be. Quote, this agreement shall incorporate by reference all performance improvement plans, warning notices, and evaluative materials relevant to said deficiencies attached herein as Appendix B and forming the factual basis for separation. End quote. Dead silence. I could practically hear him sweating through the phone. I count 0 appendices attached to the document I received and signed, I continued, my voice getting harder. Which means either my termination wasn't actually performance-based, in which case you boys need to explain why your termination letter explicitly states consistent performance deficiencies, or my termination was performance-based but you failed to provide the mandatory documentation, rendering the separation agreement invalid because it violates your own contractual requirements. Mr. Sullivan, either way, Anthony, I believe we'll be seeing each other in court. I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be exceptionally long for Apex's legal team. I ended the call before he could respond. Sometimes you have to let people know exactly where they stand. My wife Jennifer had been listening from the hallway. You planned this? I planned for the possibility they might terminate me without following proper procedures, I said. I wrote those procedures specifically to prevent what happened today. Vague performance accusations with no documentation, no improvement plans, no objective metrics. What happens now? Now we wait to see if they attempt to fabricate documentation retroactively, which constitutes fraud, or claim the appendix materials aren't actually required, contradicting their written policy, or try to settle this quietly before it becomes public knowledge that they systematically fire people without proper documentation. Which outcome do you want? Honestly, I want them to take me to court. Discovery in a wrongful termination lawsuit would expose how many others they've dismissed using identical vague performance accusations without proper documentation. I'm betting that number is substantially higher than Apex wants their investors to know. Let me tell you about how we got to this point. The termination meeting had been brief and uncomfortable. Michelle Barnes from HR and Stephen Walsh, the new chief operating officer who'd been hired 8 months ago from a competitor. Stephen was 34 years old, had an MBA and consulting background, and had made abundantly clear from day one that he considered Apex's operational approach outdated and overly bureaucratic. Translation: he thought experienced employees like me were expensive obstacles to his grand vision. Marcus, we need to discuss a serious matter regarding your performance. Stephen had begun, staring at his notepad instead of making eye contact. Already a bad sign. What performance issues? I'd asked directly. No point beating around the bush. Multiple stakeholders have raised concerns about your operational outcomes and management effectiveness. After thorough consideration, we've determined your performance doesn't meet Apex's standards. We're terminating your employment effective immediately. The corporate speak was impressive. Lots of words that said absolutely nothing specific. What specific performance deficiencies are you referencing? I pressed. The specifics are documented in your personnel file. What matters now is transition planning. I'd like to review that documentation of alleged performance deficiencies. That's not necessary for this discussion, Michelle had interjected quickly. We're prepared to offer you a separation package if you sign the agreement today. They'd slid the document across the conference table. I'd taken 38 minutes to read it thoroughly while they sat in uncomfortable silence. Most people would have felt pressured to sign quickly and get out of there. But most people don't understand that taking your time to read legal documents isn't just smart. It's essential. The terms were standard. 23-week severance, benefits continuation, non-compete clauses. But what had captured my attention was the termination classification. Termination for cause, performance deficiency, and the complete absence of any attached performance improvement plans or evaluative documentation. I'd signed it anyway, initialed every page, executed every signature line. Because I knew something Stephen and Michelle apparently didn't know. Their own policy required PIP documentation for performance terminations. By signing an agreement that lacked those materials, I was documenting their policy violation. Some people might call that a trap. I call it holding people accountable for their own rules. Thursday morning at 8:27 a.m., I received an email from Anthony Cooper that confirmed everything I suspected. Mr. Sullivan, following our conversation last night, Apex Dynamics would like to offer you the opportunity to meet and discuss revised separation documentation that addresses certain procedural oversights in the original materials. We believe revised documentation would serve both parties' interests. Can you be available Monday morning at 10 a.m. at our offices? Procedural oversights. That's corporate lawyer speak for we screwed up big time and now we're trying to fix it. I forwarded the email to my attorney, Jeffrey Morgan, who specialized in executive employment litigation and had represented numerous corporate executives in wrongful termination disputes. Jeffrey had handled my contract negotiations when I'd been promoted to VP, so he knew my background and what we were dealing with. They're panicking, Jeffrey said when I called him 20 minutes later. They realize they terminated you without following their own procedures and now they want to fix it after the fact. Can they do that? Not really. You already executed their agreement. They accepted your signature by processing your termination. They can't now claim the agreement was invalid simply because they made documentation errors. Either the agreement is valid as signed, meaning they violated their own policy, or the agreement is invalid, meaning your termination is also invalid. So what's our next move? We go to this meeting and see exactly how deep a hole they've dug for themselves. Monday morning, Jeffrey and I arrived at Apex's headquarters at 9:55 a.m. We were escorted to a large conference room where Anthony Cooper waited with two people I didn't recognize. A man in his 50s who introduced himself as Brian Thompson from Apex's outside counsel firm, and a woman in her mid-40s who turned out to be Patricia Reed, Apex's chief financial officer. The fact that they'd brought in outside counsel and the CFO told me this was bigger than just a documentation error. This was damage control at the highest level. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming, Anthony began. I think we can resolve this situation constructively. I'm listening. I kept my response short. Let them do the talking and reveal how much trouble they knew they were in. Brian Thompson opened a tablet and pulled up a document. We've prepared revised separation documentation that addresses the procedural issues with the original materials. The revised agreement includes the performance improvement documentation that should have been attached to the original, properly documenting the performance deficiencies that led to your termination. You created performance improvement plans after the termination, I said. Not a question, a statement. We obtained written documentation of performance concerns that had previously been communicated verbally. We're now providing them in written form as required by policy. Jeffrey leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, performance improvement plans should be created and implemented before the termination, not fabricated afterward. Creating them retroactively to justify a termination decision that's already been executed is not consistent with proper employment procedures. The documentation reflects genuine concerns that were communicated to Mr. Sullivan prior to his termination, Brian said carefully. Then why wasn't it documented at the time? Jeffrey asked. Why wasn't it attached to the original separation agreement as required by Apex's own policy? There was an administrative oversight. We're correcting it now. Patricia Reed spoke for the first time. Mr. Sullivan, perhaps we can approach this differently. Apex is prepared to offer enhanced severance terms, 35 weeks of severance instead of 23, extended benefits continuation for 18 months, and a mutual agreement not to pursue litigation in exchange for signing the revised separation agreement with the attached performance documentation. Jeffrey and I exchanged glances. This was significant. They were essentially offering to pay me an additional 12 weeks of severance, approximately $110,000, to accept documentation that should have been provided initially. What's in the performance documentation? I asked. What specific deficiencies am I allegedly being accused of? Brian turned his tablet toward me. 4 written documents, each from different Apex managers claiming various performance issues. I read each document carefully, taking my time while they waited. They were vague, non-specific, and critically, none included specific dates, specific incidents, specific metrics, or specific examples of the alleged deficiencies. These documents are completely generic, I said, pushing the tablet back toward him. Jason Bennett claims I failed to meet efficiency targets but doesn't cite a single specific target or metric. Susan Miller claims I showed poor judgment but doesn't identify which meeting, which budget, or which decision. The third document claims I resisted new methodologies but doesn't specify which methodologies or when this resistance occurred. More importantly, I noticed something else that made their desperation even more obvious. Paul Martinez hasn't worked at Apex for 10 months. He resigned to take a position at a competitor before Stephen Walsh even joined the company. How is he providing performance documentation about my current work? Brian's expression froze. This was the moment I knew we had them. Mr. Martinez provided the documentation based on his observations during his employment. Son, Paul Martinez left Apex before Stephen Walsh even joined the company. He couldn't possibly have observations about my performance under Stephen's leadership, which is supposedly when these performance issues became termination-worthy. You're using testimony from someone who wasn't even present during the relevant time period to justify firing me. Jeffrey was typing rapidly on his laptop. Mr. Thompson, using a former employee who left the company months before the alleged performance issues as a witness significantly undermines the credibility of this documentation. A jury would have substantial questions about why Apex couldn't find current employees willing to provide documentation critical enough to justify termination. Mr. Martinez's employment status doesn't invalidate his professional observations, Brian said, but his voice carried less conviction now. Actually, it does, Jeffrey said, because it suggests Apex couldn't find current managers willing to provide sufficiently critical documentation. So they reached out to a former employee who has no current knowledge of Mr. Sullivan's work. That's not proper documentation. That's desperation. We're not going to debate the validity of the performance documentation, Anthony said, trying to regain control of the meeting. The offer is on the table. 35 weeks severance, extended benefits, mutual release. Mr. Sullivan needs to decide if he wants to accept it or pursue litigation that will be expensive and time-consuming for everyone. I looked at each of them in turn. Anthony, nervous and sweating despite the air conditioning. Brian, trying to maintain professional composure but clearly uncomfortable with the weakness of his documentation. Patricia, calculating financial exposure in her head. We'll need time to consider, Jeffrey said, standing. Mr. Sullivan will respond to your offer within 72 hours. We left Apex's offices at 11:35 a.m. In Jeffrey's car, he turned to me with a slight smile. They're terrified. Did you see how quickly they tried to move past the Paul Martinez issue? They know that using a former employee who wasn't even present during the relevant time period is going to look terrible in court. So what do? We investigate. We find out how many other people Apex has terminated for vague performance deficiencies without proper documentation. We build a pattern and practice case showing this isn't just about you, it's about systematic policy violations. Then we take them to court, and make them pay for every single violation they've committed. Over the next 4 weeks, Jeffrey's firm conducted extensive discovery through professional networks, former employee contacts, and public records requests. What they found was even more damning than we'd expected. In the past 5 years, Apex had terminated 42 employees for performance deficiencies. Of those 42 terminations, 28 had been classified as requiring performance improvement documentation under company policy. Of those 28, only 9 had actually included attached PIP materials at the time of termination. The other 19 had been fired without the required documentation. Most of those 19 people had signed separation agreements and left quietly, but 6 had hired attorneys and filed EEOC complaints alleging discrimination. 4 had settled confidentially. 2 cases were still pending. More importantly, Jeffrey discovered a pattern that made the entire situation even more disturbing. Nearly every performance deficiency termination had occurred within 12 months of a new executive joining Apex's leadership team. The new executives would identify experienced employees as resistant to change or representing legacy mindsets and work with HR to manufacture performance allegations that would justify termination without having to admit it was really about cost reduction or management preference. Stephen Walsh, the new COO who terminated me, had done this at his previous employer as well. Jeffrey found court records showing he'd been named in 4 wrongful termination lawsuits at his prior company, all alleging he'd fired experienced employees on fabricated performance accusations. 3 cases had settled confidentially. 1 had gone to trial and resulted in a verdict against the employer. But the smoking gun came when Jeffrey's firm subpoenaed Apex's internal emails as part of the discovery process. What we found in those emails revealed the deliberate nature of what had happened. 3 weeks before my termination, Stephen Walsh had sent an email to Michelle Barnes and Patricia Reed with the subject line, Q4 Cost Reduction Strategy. The email read, "We need to reduce operational overhead by $2.8 million before year-end to hit board targets. Recommend targeting senior operations staff with highest compensation packages. Marcus Sullivan, $285,000 base, plus bonus is top of list. He's resistant to the new efficiency initiatives anyway. Let's move on this quickly. What's the cleanest termination path?" Michelle had responded. Performance-based termination requires PIP documentation per policy section 7C. We don't have current PIPs for Marcus. Creating documentation now would take 90 to 120 days minimum. Stephen's response, "Don't have that kind of time. Can we use past performance reviews or general feedback from managers?" Patricia had chimed in. "Legal will want something in writing to justify performance termination. Can we get managers to document recent concerns retroactively?" Michelle, "I can reach out to Jason, Susan, and Paul for written statements about performance concerns." Stephen, "Perfect. Get those statements and let's move forward. Keep this tight. Don't want him getting advance warning." That email chain proved several critical things. First, my termination wasn't about performance at all. It was about cost reduction. Stephen needed to cut $2.8 million from the operational budget to meet board targets, and firing senior staff was the fastest path. Second, they knew they were supposed to have PIP documentation. Michelle explicitly mentioned the policy requirement, but instead of following proper procedures, they decided to fabricate documentation after the fact. Third, they deliberately tried to keep this quiet and move quickly to prevent me from defending myself. When Jeffrey showed me those emails, I felt vindicated and disgusted simultaneously. Vindicated because it proved everything I'd suspected. Disgusted because it showed how little Apex valued the careers they were destroying. "This changes the case significantly," Jeffrey said. "This isn't just policy violations anymore. This is deliberate fraud. They knowingly terminated you without proper documentation, then tried to fabricate documentation afterward to cover their tracks." We amended our complaint to include the email evidence and add a claim for punitive damages. We increased our damages demand to $2.2 million. That's when Apex's settlement offers got serious. Within 2 weeks of filing the amended complaint, Brian Thompson called Jeffrey with a new offer, $1.6 million. "They're panicking," Jeffrey told me. "Those emails are devastating. No jury is going to side with Apex when they see executives openly discussing how to circumvent their own policies to fire someone for budget reasons." We countered at $1.9 million with no confidentiality clause. They came back at $1.7 million. We settled at $1.8 million. The final settlement included $1.8 million payment to me, written admission by Apex that my termination did not follow proper company procedures and should not have been classified as performance-based, no confidentiality clause whatsoever. Agreement by Apex to revise their cost reduction policies to explicitly prohibit using terminations as a primary cost-cutting mechanism. Agreement by Apex to implement mandatory training for all executives on employment law compliance and proper termination procedures. And a personal letter of recommendation from the board of directors acknowledging my contributions to Apex. The written admission was crucial. Most settlements include no admission of wrongdoing, but the email evidence was so damning that Apex agreed to admit they'd violated their own procedures. 9 months after the settlement, I received a phone call from Scott Patterson, who'd been on Apex's board during my termination. "Marcus, I wanted you to know something. The third-party audit found significant policy violations in how Apex was handling terminations. 21 employees who'd been fired for performance deficiencies without proper documentation. The board has approved a remediation fund to compensate those employees, approximately $5.0 million across all affected employees. Why are you telling me this? Because your lawsuit did more than get you compensation. It forced us to fix a broken system. Stephen Walsh has been asked to resign. The entire HR department has been restructured. Employees at Apex are better protected now because you refused to accept a separation agreement that violated policy requirements. The total cost to Apex of Stephen Walsh's cost reduction strategy, approximately $6.8 million in settlements, plus legal fees, plus the cost of restructuring their HR department, plus Stephen's resignation, plus the reputational damage of having multiple wrongful termination lawsuits become public. All to save $2.8 million in operational overhead. In late 2024, I started consulting for other corporations on operational best practices, including how to structure employment policies that protect both companies and employees. My experience at Apex became a case study I use in presentations about why documentation requirements matter and what happens when they're ignored. The lesson isn't just about reading your employment agreement carefully, though that's important. The lesson is about understanding that employment policies exist for a reason. When I wrote that performance improvement documentation requirement 6 years before my termination, I was protecting future employees from exactly what happened. By the time Apex realized their oversight in not attaching PAP materials, they'd already accepted my signature on an invalid agreement. That oversight cost them $6.8 million total. Sometimes the best revenge is simply making people follow the rules they agreed to in the first place. Here's what I learned. The most dangerous employee to fire isn't the one who screams or threatens lawsuits. It's the one who quietly reads every word of what you put in front of him and knows exactly what those words mean. Because when companies get sloppy with their own policies, they're not just breaking rules, they're handing you the weapon to destroy them.